affirmative team is Lorraine.
So Milgram's obedience study. Stanley Milgram was born in 1933 and grew up in the Bronx, which was a tough ghetto area of New York. He came from a working-class Jewish family that had fled Europe and escaped the Holocaust. Milgram attended school with Philip Zimbardo, where both boys dreamed of leaving the ghetto and doing something worthwhile with their lives. Milgram achieved this by becoming a world-renowned psychologist for his famous obedience study. His study was personally motivated by his family background, as he wanted to seek explanations to why ordinary German people followed orders that led to the mass murders of millions of people. The hypothesis that Milgram wanted to test was to see if the Germans have a basic character defect, namely a readiness to obey authority without question, regardless of the acts demanded by an authority figure. He originally wanted to take this study to Germany after it had been completed at Yale University in Connecticut. However, it was proved unnecessary. So the aim of Milgram's study was to see if ordinary Americans would obey an unjust order from an authority figure to inflict pain on another person. He wanted to discover what factors in a situation led to people obeying. So when designing this classic obedience study, Milgram did seek advice from his former teacher, Solomon Asch. He also consulted with other psychiatrists, students and colleagues to see what they thought and how they predicted the study would go. The three groups predicted that very few participants would go beyond 150 volts, and only 1 in 1,000 would administer the full 450 volts. The participants of the study were between 20 to 50-year-old males that were from all walks of life. They had answered an advertisement that had been placed in the local newspaper. The study would last for 1 hour and a payment of $4.50 would be received. The participants were given the money as soon as they entered the laboratory and were told that it was theirs to keep regardless of their participation in the experiment. The participants were met by a Confederate experimenter in a grey lab coat and were told the study concerned the role of punishment in learning. The participants met a second volunteer that was a Confederate. The participant played the role of the teacher and the Confederate played the part of the learner. These roles were fixed, so the participant would always be the teacher. The learner was to memorise pair words and answer using a system of lights, while the teacher was to administer shocks if the learner answered incorrectly. The Confederate learner was taken into a room, sat in a chair and attached to an electrode. The teacher was shown how the shock would feel by being given a 45-volt shock. This was in fact the highest voltage that the generator would go. The teacher was then taken into a different room and shown the generator, which was designed by Milgram himself. The generator clearly showed the number of volts and a description above on how severe the shocks became. The learner would begin by answering questions correctly and then start to make mistakes. The teacher would then administer shocks at 15 volts increments at a time. It is important to stress that no actual shocks were administered, so no bodily harm occurred. And if a mistake was to occur, only a 45-volt shock would have been given, as this was the highest voltage the machine could go. The experiment continued until either the teacher refused to continue or they had reached 450 volts. The participants were given a full debrief so they understood what had taken place and asked a series of questions to test that they were not emotionally harmed by the experiment. They were then taken to meet the unharmed learner so they could physically see that he was unharmed. The results surprised Milgram and other psychologists that were what had given their predictions at the beginning. The findings showed that while most participants dissented verbally, shockingly, 65% of participants went the full 450 volts, with all participants given 300 volts. This showed that under certain circumstances, most people obey orders even if it's against their conscience. Acts such as World War II can be explained in terms of pressure to obey a powerful authority figure, therefore disproving the German hypothesis. These type of crimes, such as the torture and murder of millions of innocent people, are caused by situational factors and not underlying characteristics of those who carry out these acts.
The first person in the opposing team is Carrie.
So I'm arguing against Milgram's experiment. The experiment more or less forced people to go against their conscience. Many participants wanted to stop, but they were told you have no choice, you must go on. Also, the fact that they were being paid, they may have felt obligated to carry on with what they were doing. There were many ethical implications attached to it. and many repeat studies haven't been 100% replications. The experiment is not true to real life, and people may act really different in a lab to how they do in real life. Milgram used only men from one area, and this makes the experiment not fully yeah, that's the one, to the population or to females. The experimenter knew it wasn't real, and he will have stayed calm throughout the experiment, so many participants may have doubted how real the experiment was and affected the possible outcome of the experiment. And Milgram more or less used and deceived people just to prove his claims, and many still argue that his experiment doesn't prove what he says and that it was a one-off. I'm burning up.
Barbara.
The second speaker in the affirmative team is Naomi.
The main issue that people seem to have with this study is the idea that participants were deceived, and while this may be the case, research has been done in which participants revealed that they felt deception was only a minor issue. In fact, they claimed they expected to be deceived in some way, as a totally honest approach would not give true results, and therefore nothing would be learned from human nature. How can a researcher reveal the true purpose of research without undermining the entire experiment? They can't. To do so would compromise the validity of the whole practice by opening the doors for bias. And this alone is the reason that more than half of psychological research published involves some level of misinformation. Of course, this deception could have been an issue if the participants had had no form of debriefing, but they did. In fact, Milgram was ahead of his time in offering this to his participants. He didn't just debrief them either. They were given questionnaires in order to evaluate the experience, with 84% saying they were happy to have taken part, 80% saying more experiments of this nature should be undertaken, 74% saying that they had learned something important about themselves, and less than 2% saying they were sorry to have taken part. Not only that, but 1 year later, 40 participants were interviewed, where it was reported that there was no evidence of emotional harm, and if the participants themselves have said there was no harm, how can the external critic claim there was? There is no basis for that argument, for the only justification needed is that of the participants, who did in fact judge it to be morally acceptable. The second issue that people seem to have with this study is the idea that the welfare of the patients was somehow at risk. Participants. Let me remind you that there were no real electric shocks, and they were told this fact after completion of the experiment. Participants were not forced to stay against their will. While there may have been several verbal responses given by the experimenter, participants could in fact get up and leave whenever they wanted. They would not have been physically restrained. If we excluded on principle the experimental creation of stress or conflict, and only allowed studies that produced positive emotions, we would end up producing lopsided psychology that caricatured rather than accurately reflected human experience. How is this ethical? If we exclude the study of such core human issues, we are in turn causing irreparable loss to any science of human behaviour. Is it not also ethical to the entire human race to gain more understanding of our own behaviour? Had the research not given us the results that we weren't comfortable accepting, would the issue of ethics even have been brought to the table? And how is it that these particular results were found distasteful, results supposedly pertaining to the entire human race, when in the 1960s it was deemed perfectly ethical to conduct research that insinuated the genetic and intellectual inferiority of ethnic minorities and led to a decline in their welfare support system and a rise in racial hatred towards them? A study that by its very nature aimed to prove inferiority, and yet this study was somehow not seen as unethical, while a study reflecting human nature as a whole, in whatever form, was. It must be remembered that this study was carried out before the Code of Ethics was in place, and yet still every care was taken to ensure the emotional safety of its participants. Milgram's intentions were not wicked. He hoped that by gaining an understanding of the nature of obedience, that we would be able to prevent in the future the atrocities that occurred in the Second World War, and for that reason it is clearly an ethically sound piece of research.
The second speaker in the opposing team is Kelly.
Milgram's study wasn't at all ethically sound. He was in breach of many guidelines set out by British Psychological Society today. To start, none of the participants knew what they had signed up for. Through deception, participants actually believed they were giving massive vaults of electricity to fellow participants, never knowing the other participant was actually a confidant of Milgram. This deception also has implications on informed consent, as participants never knew what they was actually consenting for. Another breach in these guidelines was the protection of psychological harm. During this experiment, some participants showed massive signs of stress, including stuttering, nail biting, and even digging their nails into their own skin. A few participants even had seizures during this time. None of the participants were ever tested beforehand to see if they could actually cope with the stress of this experiment. This could have led to post-traumatic stress disorder from the ordeal they went through. They did, however, have the right to withdraw. However, the experimenter did make it very difficult, constantly urging the participant to carry on shocking the other person. Although Milgram defends his actions, stating he couldn't have predicted the levels of stress put on the participants, he could have ever been honest from the start with what he was planning on doing, and at the very least he could have tested to see whether they could have coped with the stress in the first place.
The third speaker in the affirmative team is Whitney.
Before the experiment began, the participants, which were psychology students, were interviewed. Less than 3% estimated that they would not go to the maximum level 450 volts. The end results found that 65% of participants continued to the highest voltage. Milgram found that people would harm others in order to obey by authority. He suggested that it is not always evil people committing crimes, but possibly ordinary people obeying orders. Milgram was criticised about his experiment as it was seen as unethical, but I believe he gathered some interesting, useful information about human behaviour, which I would say justifies the means. His study was also critiqued by Orne and Holland in 1968 for the lack of experimental validity. People suspect that the participants knew they were doing what they were doing and just going along with the act. Although some participants showed distress during the study, Orne and Holland also suggested that the experiment lacked ecological validity, as it took place within Milgram's laboratory, which had little resemblance of a real-life situation. However, I feel even with the information gathered, Milgram created an experiment which was shockingly interesting, as it provided people with the simple fact that people will conform to authority no matter what the cost, even if that means hurting an innocent person. Orne and Holland claimed that the participants didn't believe they were administrating the shocks. They believed the participants were just going along with it. However, they could not back their claim up by saying why would people not walk out and just leave if they didn't believe it. Orne and Holland argued that Milgram's study lacked the resemblance of a real-life situation. Milgram cited evidence disputed Orne and Holland's claims. He gathered film footage made of some of the participants during the experiment, which clearly showed the distress of participants. He also gathered the post-experimental interviews and questionnaires, which provided evidence that the participants believed they were administrating real shocks. If Orne and Holland... Milgram's experiment had been replicated several times in other countries with different levels of obedience found in each. Germany had a higher level of obedience and lower levels found in the Australian study. This provides evidence that supports Milgram's argument that extreme levels of obedience can be obtained in labs other than his own. In order for Milgram's study to be effective and for the results to be realistic, Milgram had to make the participants believe they were administrating the shocks. Therefore, deception and lack of informed consent was crucial to receive real results.
The third speaker in the opposing team is Jordan.
There were several weaknesses of Milgram's study, and the most of it to do with the amount of ethical issues that Milgram broke. The first was deception. The participants of Milgram's study were deceived and they were told that the experiment was about the effect of punishment in learning, and they were made to believe that they were giving real electrical shocks to the participants. Milgram thought it necessary for the study to break these ethical codes to pursue and gain the information required to prove his hypothesis. However, there have also been some questions of the participants' right to withdraw, as participants in the study were forced or encouraged to continue. For example, if they showed any sign of reluctance to pursue, to progressing with the electrical shocks, they were given the researchers were given 4 points to help encourage. 1, please continue. The second, the experiment requires that you continue. Thirdly, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And 4th, you have no other choice, you must go on. Going on from that point, the clues of the authority figures of please go on may have been made to feel as they had no choice but to continue. The final ethical issue which we can look at that Milgram broke is perhaps the most important, and is to do with the protection of harm. After the experiment, the majority of the participants reported feeling high levels of stress and also showed clear signs of distress during the experiment. Post-study interviews showed the experiment caused no long negative effect, but can Milgram really excuse breaking these ethical guidelines to begin with? Also, the previously mentioned, there is a lack of ecological validity to the study. As a study carried out in a laboratory, the participants knew they were being observed and studied, and they were people on the other side monitoring and taking notes of their behaviour.